If you're a fan of lists of books and you like them just a little bit pretentious, then today's book series just might be for you. Today I'll be reviewing the New York Times Top 100 Books of the 21st Century. Welcome to Spencer Reads Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan, and today I'll be taking a look at a list that came out just a couple weeks ago. Actually, the New York Times has been releasing it slowly over the last couple weeks, but just a few weeks ago, they finally gave the last 20 books in their top 100 books of the 21st century. I just want to take a look at, well, first of all, how well I've done on this list, looking at them, how many of them I've read, and then some reflection on the books that are in the list, maybe a little bit about the nature of the list, and then finally my opinion on lists like this in general. And in regular fashion, I try to tell you who I think this list might be for, and then who I don't think would particularly enjoy this list. Looking at the list, I've read 9 of the 100 books. Just so you guys know, those 9 would be The Underground Railroad, Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City, Between the World and Me, The Goldfinch, Persepolis, Trust, Stay True, Demon Copperhead, The Emperor of All Maladies. So those are the 9 that I've read. And just looking at them, actually the bulk of what I've read on that list came out just last year. Several of them I read because they were Pulitzer Prize winners or nominees, and so that was the big reason I would have read them. Looking at the list, there's another 11 books that I have had on my short list for a long time, so I will probably read them and do a review of them within the next year or two. And then there's another 15 or so that I would say are books that are in my orbit that I've considered reading. I've contemplated reading them. I probably will read them at some point. I just haven't quite put them on a short list, which means that there are 65 books on this list that I don't exactly have a major interest in reading. I probably haven't even heard of most of them. Quite a few of them I do recognize the authors, and so that gives me a sense of what type of book they are. And they are books I would probably read at some point, or I would at least entertain the idea of it, but that does still mean that 2/3 of this list are books that I have not interacted with in any real way. The thing that really surprises me when I think of the fact that I've only read 9 of these 25 books is, one, because of how many books I read, and two, because of how wide-reaching my reading list is. I try to read about as many nonfiction as fiction books. I try to read some memoirs, some biographies, general nonfiction. I try to read a variety of fiction like fantasy, sci-fi, detective, or just a more generic type of fiction. And it's over the last 25 years, which means I was in middle school when the beginning of this list starts in January 1st, 2000, which means this covers all of my high school years, all of my college years, my undergrad, my graduate, my PhD program, all of that. These are books that would have come out during that time period. So that means that if I'm reading 200 books a year, which I try to do, then this list should have a little bit more of what I would read on it. At least I would think so. And I think there's a few reasons why there are not a lot of the books that I read on this list. And I think that that might be an issue for some people when it comes to a list like this. For starters, only about a quarter of the books on this list are nonfiction. And since I try to read about 50-50, that would be one of the big problems as to why I would only have 9 books on this list. On top of that, a good deal of the nonfiction on this list are actually memoirs. And I do read memoirs. I can enjoy a good memoir, but I also feel like a memoir is barely nonfiction. I just think that the whole purpose of a memoir is so different from basically any other type of nonfiction book that I don't quite categorize it the same as a nonfiction. And I'm not saying there's not good memoirs. I absolutely think there are some great memoirs out there, but I would just have a hard time characterizing this in the same field as the type of nonfiction that I would generally read, especially as a historian that is interested in a particular time and place. I just don't think that I would find too many memoirs of great interest in my day-to-day reading list. And so I think that that's one reason why, again, I have so few of the books on this list. But I think the most obvious reason why I have so few books on this list is because I do read widely. And this book list is not a wide variety. This only has, I think, 1 fantasy book on it. There's a few post-apocalyptic books on it, which I guess you could consider those maybe fantasy or something along those lines, even if they don't have a magical element. It is some kind of genre, but it has no horror, it has no sci-fi, it has no detective novels that I'm aware of. It is not particularly genre driven, and I think that that might be a problem. If you're going to call yourself the best 100 books, but you don't represent a wide variety of books, I think that's one of the issues with a list like this. And so I think that might be something that people would struggle with. Maybe I'm just annoyed because I only had 9 books on this list, and that's just me admitting that I'm not as well read as I thought, or I don't read as literary of books as I would have expected. I mean, this list was composed of a lot of literary figures, people like Stephen King, are people that put down their, well, I think they did their top 10, and all these different ballots got collected, and this is the aggregate of those ballots are all these different people's top 10 lists that got turned into this list of 100. And so when I hear that, I just think to myself, well, I'm just not reading the same thing as other people, especially people whose lives are in literature. And that is a little harder for me to understand and a little harder for me to engage with. And so I'm just kind of curious as to where I would have done things differently. And I don't think I would have called it the best books of the last 25 years. I just think the term best is highly problematic. Best in what? I mean, I'm not going to go entirely off of sales here, but I'm pretty sure that if I were to compare the sales of most of the books on this list to some of your better known books, they would blow them out of the water. I mean, I'm not suggesting this, but books like books by Brandon Sanderson or books by Stephen King, who ironically is not on this list at all, would have way more books being sold than a good deal of the books on this list, probably almost every book on this list, which raises the question of what makes a book best then. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that every book that has sold millions of copies automatically makes it the best book. I can see the argument for why you wouldn't want a list full of books like Twilight and Harry Potter. That's fine, but the fact that this list is so limited in its scope, at least in terms of what came into this, yet you call them best books, I think that makes it hard for people to use this list to get into books. This book list is only going to be for people that already read and already read these types of books. I think most people like me that are big fans of fantasy, they're going to come to this list and be like, well, I don't see any books on here that I would be interested in, so this list is useless to me. And I think that's a problem when you make a list like this. I don't think they should have used the term best, or if they had used the term best, they should have been more specific about what types of books these were in terms of, well, essentially not including any other genres. I think that that's a real problem for a list like this. I would have, at the very least, split fiction and nonfiction off of this and made 2 completely different lists if I could have. I think putting those together is already a problem in and of itself. I would have really put an effort into getting people to give me, if you couldn't have put together a whole top 100 of, say, sci-fi or fantasy, at least put forth a whole separate list of like top 50 or top 25. I think that would have been much better served than putting together this list of 100 books that just doesn't have enough diversity in its genres to really have the appeal or the usefulness to people. And so in the end, it just kind of comes off as a bit pretentious in my opinion. So who would I say this list is for? Well, everyone I just mentioned who is probably already reading books like this, and so they're seeing more books that they already know. One advantage I will say to a book list like this is that, especially since I said 65 of these books I'm not even really familiar with, that does give me a lot of books I can explore, and I'm confident I would like a good deal of them. And so I'm very much interested in exploring some of these books. Am I going to go through and read this whole list? Almost definitely not. Simply because, and not because it's too many books. I read 200 books a year, so 100 books is not that big of a deal. But the issue is simply the fact that I'm confident most of these books are not going to appeal to me, especially since they're not going to get me steeped into any kind of new type of genre. I do know some of these are going to be a little experimental. I do find that interesting, but as a whole, I'm not going to be interested in book after book that is just not any type of genre that I'm familiar with, or I'm going to constantly be finding myself trying to figure out how exactly to connect to a book when I just don't have enough experience with these types of books. But I do think that simply having a list like this means every one of these 100 books is going to get a little more attention, especially since, like I said, none of these books are going to be your massive paperback sellers. I mean, I'm sure some of them did pretty well, but we're talking, the level of Stephen King or anyone else that you would find in an airport bookstore. I would say almost all of these would have some benefit from being on a list like this, and I think that's a good thing for it, especially since I want more people to read. Who I don't think this list is for is someone that's, sitting at home saying, I need to read more, What are some good book suggestions? I actually think this would be a terrible list for them to go to. I think that a lot of these books they would get into and be like, this is too heavy for me, this is too challenging for me, this is one of the reasons why I don't put a lot of time and energy into reading. I think this could be a net negative for someone like that. I would much more promote people trying to get into, again, genre, that's what I keep mentioning, or just trying to find books that are specifically a little easier to connect with or a little easier to read. I find a lot of these books are just going to be a little too difficult for most people. And I'm just a little bothered that this list even exists, because I feel like based off the title, it's essentially clickbait, which is sad because thousands of people worked at putting their list together. And I think that what they put on their list is genuine interest in those 10 books. But I think the way that it was structured and presented is nothing but clickbait to me. And so I'm not super interested in that aspect of this. And I wish it had been framed better. But hey, I know there are lots of opinions on this list, and I would greatly appreciate some thoughts in the comments. Please let me know if you enjoyed this list generally, you just thought maybe you would change a few books, or if, like me, you think that this whole list is kind of problematic and you think that there's way more virtue in creating lists that are based on genres or based on trying to get people more interested in books as a whole, and you think that this is a little bit pretentious, or whatever your thoughts are. Please let me know. I'm sure that I have, enraged lots of people, and I'm sure there's some people that have completely agreed with me, and I really would like to know people's thoughts on that. Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, hit that notification button, and until next time, keep those pages turning.